5,000 years ago, according to clay pressed by human hands, beings descended before kings existed, before borders, before history knew its own name. Cities were said to rise because they commanded it. Humans were shaped because labor was needed, and fate itself was negotiated in councils not of men. Why did the first civilization claim it was designed rather than discovered? Why were humans described as engineered from earth and divine essence, not born naturally? Why do floods, divine oaths, and population control appear at the very start of written memory? Why do the oldest texts sound less like myth and more like testimony? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Clay hardens slowly under the Mesopotamian sun, and in that slow transformation something else hardened with it. Memory. Along the low plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, where dust clung to skin and water decided who lived or starved, people learned that nothing endured unless it was impressed into earth itself. Long before marble statues or written books, these communities pressed reed styluses into wet tablets, leaving wedge-shaped marks that looked insignificant until one realizes they still speak after 5 millennia. What survives in those tablets is not nostalgia or poetry at first, but accounting. Grain counted, cattle recorded, labor measured. Civilization did not begin with wonder. It began with management. The land itself demanded it. Southern Mesopotamia offered no stone forests, no predictable floods like the Nile. The rivers arrived violently or not at all, shifting channels, drowning fields, abandoning cities without warning. Survival depended on cooperation at a scale unknown elsewhere. Canals had to be dug, dredged, and defended. Dikes had to be repaired before the next surge erased months of labor. This was not heroic work. It was relentless, repetitive, and essential. The people who mastered it transformed marshland into surplus, and surplus into cities. By the 4th millennium BCE, settlements like Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur were no longer villages but organisms. Uruk alone stretched over miles, its population approaching numbers that would not be matched again for centuries. Mud brick walls enclosed neighborhoods, workshops, temples, and storehouses, each dependent on the others. At the center rose stepped platforms, later called ziggurats, artificial mountains built because the land had none. They dominated the horizon not as monuments to beauty, but as anchors of order. From their heights, priests watched the skies and tracked the movements of celestial bodies, believing patterns above mirrored intentions below. These priests were not mystics removed from labor. They were administrators, engineers, and record keepers. They measured barley rations, assigned workers, scheduled canal maintenance, and recorded debts. Writing emerged from this need, evolving from pictorial marks into a flexible system capable of expressing abstract ideas. Over generations, those practical symbols acquired the ability to carry stories, hymns, and explanations of why the world functioned as it did. When myths finally appeared in written form, they arrived already ancient, shaped by voices long gone. Within those myths, the Anunnaki appear not as distant abstractions, but as authorities embedded in the same systems humans navigated daily. They were described as rulers who organized the world much as city leaders organized labor. In these stories, Order did not emerge naturally. It was imposed, negotiated, and enforced. Heaven and earth were once joined, then separated. Waters were assigned boundaries. Roles were distributed. The gods themselves labored before humans existed, digging canals and shaping the land, an image that mirrors the real exhaustion of the environment's first engineers. The divine hierarchy reflected the social one. At the apex stood Anu, embodiment of the sky, remote and rarely intervening. Power on the ground belonged to Enlil, whose domain was wind, authority, and decree. He represented structure without softness, the kind of rule required to keep cities functioning, but feared for its indifference. Alongside him moved Enki, associated with fresh water flowing beneath the earth, a hidden reservoir imagined as feeding all rivers and wells. Where Enlil enforced, Enki adapted. Where one punished noise and disorder, the other looked for clever solutions that preserved life. These gods were not perfect. They argued, miscalculated, and reacted emotionally. Their flaws mattered because humanity was shaped within those tensions. According to the earliest accounts, humans were not created for companionship or moral growth. They were introduced as a solution to a logistical problem. Lesser gods, burdened with endless labor, rebelled. Faced with unrest that threatened cosmic stability, the ruling gods chose not reform, but replacement. A new being would take over the work. The description of that creation is unsettling in its precision. Clay from the earth was mixed with the blood of a sacrificed deity, granting humans intelligence while binding them to mortality. Birth was depicted not as spontaneous miracle, but as process, involving measured steps and incubation. This language reflects a culture familiar with production, one that understood life itself as something assembled under constraint. Humanity entered the world already assigned a function, to maintain the systems that allowed civilization to exist. For a time, this arrangement succeeded. Humans worked the fields, maintained canals, and multiplied. Cities grew louder, busier, more complex. Noise in these texts does not only mean sound, it suggests disruption, presence, autonomy. Humanity became noticeable. To Enlil, this was intolerable. Plagues, droughts, and famine followed, each an attempt to restore balance by reducing numbers. Each time, Enki intervened indirectly, guiding humans toward rituals or actions that mitigated disaster. Survival was never framed as defiance, but as adaptation, intelligence responding to authority. This tension culminated in the flood, a narrative that echoes through later cultures because it encapsulates the Sumerian worldview. Total destruction was chosen not out of cruelty alone, but exhaustion. The gods sought silence. Yet even as the waters rose, regret followed. The same texts that describe divine wrath also describe divine fear and hunger, gods retreating and realizing too late that humanity was not expendable. Without offerings, without labor, the world stalled. After the waters receded, nothing returned unchanged. Limits were imposed. Shorter lifespans, infertility, mortality as structure rather than accident. These measures were not punishments, but controls, a recalibration of a system that had nearly collapsed. Humanity survived not because it was innocent, but because it was necessary. From this point forward, civilization took on its recognizable form. Kingship was introduced as an intermediary layer, authority delegated downward. Kings were not gods, but their legitimacy flowed from divine sanction. Law codes emerged to formalize expectations, ensuring order persisted even when divine attention wavered. writing expanded beyond accounting into literature, preserving memory as a defense against chaos. What matters in these accounts is not whether they describe literal events, but how they frame existence. Humans are depicted as essential but constrained, creative yet bound, intelligent yet mortal. Work is not a curse, but the mechanism through which order is sustained. Suffering is not meaningless, but the cost of balance in a volatile world. The Anunnaki are not saviors or invaders. They are explanations for structure itself. By embedding divine intention into irrigation, law, and labor, the Sumerians transformed survival into meaning. Their myths do not promise salvation after death. They offer something more immediate: continuity. To work was to participate in a cosmic project older than memory. To record was to resist erasure. In clay and story, they built something that outlasted their cities, preserving the moment when humanity first understood itself as designed, not accidental. Once humanity assumed its assigned role, the world described in the tablets began to settle into rhythm rather than peace. Fields were planted, canals cleared, temples stocked, and offerings delivered on schedule. Order existed, but it was fragile, maintained only through constant effort. In Sumerian thought, the universe did not naturally remain balanced. It leaned toward collapse unless restrained by labor, ritual, and authority. Civilization was not a triumph over chaos so much as a negotiated delay of it. The gods themselves were bound by this tension. Enlil's decrees defined boundaries, yet boundaries required enforcement. Storms, droughts, and floods were not random disasters, but expressions of imbalance, moments when divine restraint slipped. To live in Mesopotamia meant accepting uncertainty as normal. The land could reward diligence with abundance or erase it overnight. This volatility shaped not only agriculture, but psychology. Humans learned early that effort did not guarantee security, only the chance of it. Temples became the anchors of stability. Each city-state centered itself around a patron deity whose presence was believed to physically reside within a statue housed at the temple's core. These statues were not symbols in the modern sense. Through elaborate consecration rituals, they were thought to become living vessels. They ate, drank, slept, and traveled during festivals. Priests washed and clothed them daily, maintaining divine comfort as carefully as canal banks. Neglect was dangerous. A god denied proper care might withdraw protection or invite catastrophe. The economy revolved around these sacred centers. Temple estates controlled vast tracts of land, herds of livestock, and workshops staffed by specialists. Barley functioned as currency, distributed as wages, and stored against famine. Contracts were recorded in clay, sealed with cylinder seals carved with personal insignia. These seals acted like signatures, rolled across wet clay to bind agreements. Trust did not rely on character, but documentation. Memory pressed into earth replaced reliance on spoken promises. Within this system, scribes held unusual power. Literacy was rare and demanding, requiring mastery of hundreds of signs. Scribal schools drilled students relentlessly, copying texts until mistakes disappeared. Their work was not creative in the modern sense. Precision mattered more than originality. Errors could disrupt ritual formulas or legal judgments, risking divine displeasure or social conflict. Through repetition, scribes became custodians of continuity, ensuring that knowledge survived individual lives. Mythology reinforced this structure. Stories of Enki distributing the me, the fundamental principles governing civilization, framed technology and culture as divine gifts. These Mi were not abstract laws, but practical capacities: kingship, weaving, metalworking, music, sexual norms, justice. When Inanna acquired many of them and brought them to Uruk, the myth explained why certain cities dominated culturally and politically. Power was justified not by conquest alone, but by possession of divine authorization. Human relationships mirrored divine ones. Families functioned as economic units. Marriage contracts specified obligations, dowries, and penalties. Children were assets and vulnerabilities, sources of labor and continuity, but also mouths to feed. Mortality hovered constantly. Disease, injury, and childbirth carried high risk. The underworld offered no comfort. After death, all souls faced the same dim existence, consuming dust and shadows regardless of virtue. Without hope of reward beyond life, meaning had to be constructed within it. This worldview encouraged practical ethics. Justice mattered because it shaped the living community, not because it affected an afterlife. Kings were expected to protect widows, orphans, and the poor, not out of compassion alone, but to maintain cosmic balance. Law codes articulated this responsibility. Punishments were harsh by modern standards, yet they aimed at predictability. Knowing the consequence of an action reduced chaos. Stability was moral. Despite rigid structures, innovation thrived. Mathematics developed to measure fields and calculate rations, evolving into abstract problem-solving. A base 60 system emerged, useful for dividing time and space. Astronomy advanced through meticulous observation, linking celestial cycles to agricultural planning and ritual calendars. These practices were not separate from religion. Studying the sky was a way of reading divine intention written across the heavens. Yet tension persisted between control and excess. Cities competed for water, land, and prestige. Warfare was common, framed as conflict between patron gods enacted through human armies. Victory signified divine favor. Defeat implied withdrawal or punishment. Conquerors often seized the defeated city's divine statue, symbolically capturing its god. This act destabilized the losing city more effectively than destroying walls. Without its deity, order unraveled. The myths acknowledge this instability openly. The gods argue, regret decisions, and change strategies. The flood narrative ends not with triumph, but compromise. Measures like reduced lifespans and infertility were administrative solutions, not moral judgments. Humanity became manageable rather than erased. This pragmatism pervades Sumerian thought. Ideals mattered less than outcomes. Survival required adaptation rather than purity. Work, therefore, gained existential weight. To labor was to sustain not only oneself, but the universe's equilibrium. Digging a canal echoed the gods' original acts. Baking bread and offering it at a temple reenacted creation's maintenance. Even mundane tasks participated in something vast. This framing transformed necessity into purpose. Suffering did not disappear, but it gained context. Over time, these ideas shaped a civilization capable of endurance. Cities rose, fell, and were rebuilt. Languages shifted, yet scribes preserved older texts, treating Sumerian as a sacred language long after it ceased to be spoken. This reverence for the past reinforced continuity. New rulers adopted ancient myths, inserting themselves into established frameworks rather than discarding them. What emerges from this world is not blind obedience but negotiated existence. Humans were created to serve, yet service allowed creativity, community, and legacy. The gods imposed limits, yet relied on human participation. Civilization functioned as a contract without signatures, enforced by ritual, labor, and memory. The clay tablets do not promise happiness. They offer something more realistic. Order is temporary. Balance requires effort. Authority can protect or destroy. Wisdom lies in flexibility rather than defiance. By encoding these lessons into stories, laws, and daily practice, the Sumerians articulated a vision of life grounded in reality rather than hope. Their legacy is not the claim that gods walked the earth, but the recognition that civilization itself is an act of continuous creation, vulnerable, exhausting, and worth maintaining. As generations passed, the memory of creation did not fade. It thickened. Stories accumulated like sediment, each layer reinforcing the belief that civilization was not accidental but entrusted. The gods had imposed structure, and humans had learned to live within it. Yet the arrangement was never static. Power shifted, cities fell, new rulers rose, and the divine order adjusted accordingly. What remained constant was the conviction that history itself unfolded under supervision, watched, corrected, and sometimes interrupted by forces beyond human reach. Kingship emerged as the most visible expression of this relationship. Early rulers did not claim to be gods, but they were never merely human either. They described themselves as chosen, lifted up, or called by name by the divine. This language mattered. It framed authority as responsibility rather than entitlement. A king's task was not personal glory, but maintenance, repairing canals, enforcing justice, leading armies when necessary, and ensuring temples functioned without interruption. Failure in any of these duties risked more than rebellion. It risked cosmic imbalance. The Sumerian king list illustrates this mindset vividly. It records rulers who reigned for impossibly long spans before the flood, followed by more realistic reigns afterward. These exaggerated numbers are not meant as historical statistics, but as signals. Time itself was altered by catastrophe. The flood marked a rupture between an earlier age of proximity to the gods and a later age of limitation. Afterward, humans ruled shorter lives under stricter constraints. History, like biology, had been regulated. Law became the mechanism that replaced divine immediacy. Rather than constant intervention, the gods allowed order to be maintained through codified rules. Early law codes framed justice as alignment with divine will. Judges swore oaths invoking gods who would punish dishonesty. Verdicts were written, stored, and referenced, reinforcing the idea that fairness could be standardized. This was revolutionary. It meant that even rulers were bound by expectations, at least in theory. A king who ignored justice risked divine displeasure, expressed through military defeat or natural disaster. Literature flourished within this structure. Hymns praised gods for stability and abundance, while laments mourned destroyed cities, treating ruins as moral lessons. These laments describe temples abandoned, canals clogged, and gods departing their shrines, carried away by enemies or withdrawing in anger. Destruction was never random. It was explained as consequence. The land reflected moral failure as much as environmental stress. One figure stands out in this literary landscape: Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. His story, preserved through multiple versions, explores the limits of power. 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, Gilgamesh begins as a tyrant, exhausting its people through unchecked ambition. The gods respond not by destroying him, but by balancing him. Enkidu is created, a wild man shaped from clay, living among animals. Civilization and wilderness collide in their meeting, not as enemies, but mirrors. Through friendship, Gilgamesh learns restraint. Enkidu's death transforms the epic from heroic adventure into existential inquiry. Faced with mortality, Gilgamesh confronts the same reality all humans share despite rank or strength. His journey to seek immortality leads him to the flood survivor, a man who once escaped death by divine exception. The answer Gilgamesh receives is not hopeful. Immortality was a singular administrative decision, not a reward available to others. Even divine ancestry could not bypass imposed limits. The episode with the stolen plant of youth reinforces this lesson. Gilgamesh achieves success through effort, only to lose it through inattention. The serpent that consumes the plant sheds its skin, renewing itself effortlessly. Humans do not. The implication is stark. Nature renews, animals adapt, but humans remember. Memory, not immortality, defines their legacy. This emphasis on remembrance shaped social values. To be forgotten was a second death. Names inscribed on tablets, offerings made for ancestors, and stories retold across generations served as defenses against oblivion. Writing became a moral act. Scribes preserved not only accounts, but identity. Even kings feared erasure more than death. As empires replaced city-states, these ideas endured. Akkadian-speaking rulers adopted Sumerian myths, translating them while preserving their structure. Gods acquired new names, but retained familiar roles. Enki became Ea, Inanna became Ishtar, but wisdom, fertility, and conflict remained constant. This adaptability allowed continuity across conquest. Culture proved more durable than political boundaries. The Babylonian reconfiguration of mythology illustrates this process. In the Enuma Elish, a younger god rises to supremacy through combat and reorganization. The universe is fashioned from defeated chaos, and humanity is created again from divine blood. The narrative echoes earlier creation stories while recentering authority. Marduk's rise mirrored Babylon's political ascent. Theology adjusted to reality without discarding inherited frameworks. Throughout these transformations, the core relationship between humans and gods remained transactional. Worship was not passive belief, but active service. Offerings fed gods believed to require sustenance. Festivals reenacted creation, renewing cosmic order annually. The New Year celebration was not symbolic theater. It was maintenance. Without it, the year itself might unravel. These rituals reinforced humility. Humans did not control fate, but they influenced it through proper action. Prayer was negotiation, sacrifice a form of communication. Silence from the gods was feared more than punishment. It signaled abandonment. A city without divine attention was already lost. Yet despite dependence, the texts reveal subtle resistance. Enki's repeated interventions on humanity's behalf suggest that compassion existed within authority. Trickery, intelligence, and flexibility were valued alongside obedience. Survival often depended on bending rules without breaking them. Wisdom was not submission, but discernment. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization had refined a world view that accepted limitation without surrender. Life was harsh, the gods unpredictable, death inevitable. Yet meaning persisted through work, memory, and community. Civilization was not a gift bestowed once, but a burden carried continuously. The gods had initiated it, but humans sustained it. This perspective explains why these stories endured. They did not promise escape from suffering. They explained it, contextualized it, and made it survivable. In doing so, they offered one of humanity's earliest answers to the problem of existence. Order is temporary, effort is required, and remembrance is the closest thing to eternity we are given. As cities multiplied and dynasties replaced one another, the world described in the tablets grew denser, layered with memory and precedent. What had once been a small network of settlements bound by canals became a mosaic of competing powers, each claiming divine favor, each insisting its rituals preserved cosmic balance more faithfully than its rivals. Continuity no longer depended only on labor and kingship. It required interpretation. The past had to be explained in ways that justified the present. This was the age in which myth hardened into tradition. Stories once flexible through oral retelling were fixed into canonical forms by scribes working under temple authority. These texts did not eliminate contradiction. They preserved it. Different versions of creation, flood, and divine conflict coexisted without concern for consistency. Truth was not singular. It was cumulative, built from layers of remembered meaning rather than linear logic. One of the most significant shifts during this period was the gradual blending of cultures. Sumerian was no longer the only language spoken in the land between the rivers. Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, spread alongside it, carried by populations who had lived in Mesopotamia for centuries, but now rose to political prominence. Rather than erasing Sumerian culture, Akkadian rulers absorbed it. Temples continued their rituals. Gods retained their identities, though names changed. Enki became Ea. Inanna became Ishtar. The stories persisted, translated rather than replaced. This act of translation mattered. Language reshapes thought. When myths moved into Akkadian, subtle shifts occurred in emphasis and tone. The gods became more centralized, hierarchies more explicit. Where earlier traditions tolerated ambiguity, later ones leaned toward consolidation. Divine authority began to mirror imperial ambition. As human rulers extended control over wider territories, theology adjusted to reflect that scale. The clearest example appears in the Babylonian creation epic, a retelling that reframes cosmic history as conquest. In this version, order is not negotiated, but won through violence. Chaos is personified as a monstrous maternal force, defeated by a younger god whose rise parallels Babylon's political ascent. Creation emerges not from cooperation, but dismemberment. The world is literally built from the remains of a vanquished power. Humanity's role remains unchanged in function, but altered in explanation. Humans are still created to serve, to bear labor so the gods may rest. But now, their rebellious nature is emphasized. They are made from the blood of a god who opposed divine authority, embedding disobedience into human essence. This reinterpretation explains social instability as innate rather than circumstantial. Where earlier myths blamed conditions, later ones blamed nature. Despite these shifts, older ideas never fully disappeared. Sumerian texts continued to be copied, studied, and revered. They functioned as a sacred archive, consulted for legitimacy and wisdom. Scribes learned Sumerian long after it ceased to be spoken, treating it as a language of origins. Knowledge of the past became a form of power, granting access to divine intention as it was first articulated. This reverence for antiquity shaped how disasters were understood. When cities fell to war or famine, explanations were sought in ritual failure or forgotten obligations. Lamentation texts emerged, poetic records of destruction that mourned ruined temples and abandoned streets. These were not calls for revenge, but acts of remembrance. By naming loss, they preserved connection. Forgetting was the greater threat. The underworld remained unchanged in these narratives. It offered no justice, no redemption. All souls descended to the same dim existence. This consistency reinforced the importance of life before death. Achievements mattered only insofar as they affected the living world. A king's reputation endured through inscriptions. A city's identity survived through ritual continuity. Meaning was externalized, embedded in structures that outlasted flesh. Law codes expanded during this era, formalizing expectations across diverse populations. These were not philosophical treatises, but practical instruments. They listed penalties, procedures, and compensations, aiming to reduce uncertainty. Justice was not equal, but predictable. Social hierarchy was acknowledged rather than denied. Stability mattered more than fairness as an abstract principle. Even so, concern for the vulnerable appears repeatedly. Widows, orphans, and the poor are invoked as measures of a ruler's legitimacy. Protection of these groups signaled alignment with divine order. Abuse of power risked cosmic repercussions. This was not moral idealism, but risk management. Disorder invited divine attention, and divine attention was rarely gentle. Within households, daily rituals mirrored temple practice. Small offerings were made to household gods. Ancestors were remembered through food and drink. The boundary between sacred and mundane blurred. Religion was not confined to festivals or sanctuaries. It structured time, behavior, and expectation. Even silence had meaning. Excessive noise, as myths reminded, could disturb higher powers. Astronomy continued to develop, increasingly systematized through observation and record-keeping. Celestial events were interpreted as messages, warnings, or confirmations. Eclipses threatened kings, prompting substitution rituals in which temporary rulers absorbed ill fate. These practices reveal a worldview that treated symbols as operational realities. Belief was not internal conviction, but enacted response. Throughout these transformations, one principle endured. Civilization was fragile. Floods, droughts, invasions, and internal collapse loomed constantly. The myths did not deny this fragility, they explained it. The world existed on borrowed stability, maintained through effort, memory, and adaptation. The Anunnaki were not guarantors of safety, but custodians of balance, often imperfect and reactive. By preserving stories of divine error alongside divine power, Mesopotamian culture acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering to it. Humans could not control fate, but they could respond wisely. They could build redundancies, record knowledge, and remember lessons encoded in myth. In this sense, the evolution of myth across languages and empires reflects the same impulse that drove canal maintenance and city building. It was an act of preservation against erasure. As long as stories were copied, rituals performed, and names remembered, the world remained intelligible. Civilization endured not because it was ordained, but because it was continuously reconstructed from the fragments of what came before. As the centuries accumulated, Mesopotamian civilization entered a phase where memory itself became a contested resource. Empires expanded beyond single river valleys, absorbing diverse peoples whose customs, gods, and histories did not easily align. Holding such complexity together required more than force. It demanded narrative coherence, a shared explanation for why authority existed and why obedience mattered. Mythology, law, and ritual fused into a single operating system that made empire possible. The Assyrians exemplified this transformation. Rising from the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, they inherited the same gods, scripts, and stories, but wielded them with unprecedented intensity. Their kings presented themselves not merely as chosen by the gods, but as instruments of divine will made manifest through conquest. Warfare was framed as ritual action. To expand borders was to restore order. Destruction of enemy cities was not excess, but purification. Royal inscriptions carved into stone and clay reinforced this worldview. Kings described campaigns in meticulous detail, listing cities crushed, captives taken, tribute extracted. These texts were not private boasts. They were public affirmations that the king acted with divine approval. Enlil, Ashur, or Ishtar marched alongside armies, legitimizing violence as necessity. The same gods who demanded order in irrigation now demanded it in politics. Yet beneath this rhetoric lay anxiety. Assyrian kings performed elaborate rituals to ward off omens, consult diviners, and appease gods offended by bloodshed. Conquest expanded responsibility as much as power. The larger the empire, the more fragile its balance. Every eclipse, unusual birth, or damaged statue threatened collapse. Control required constant vigilance. Libraries emerged as a response to this pressure. The most famous, assembled under Ashurbanipal, collected texts from across Mesopotamia. Myths, rituals, medical treatises, astronomical records, and omen lists were gathered, copied, and archived. This was not antiquarian curiosity. It was strategic preservation. Knowledge provided leverage over uncertainty. By cataloging the past, rulers sought to predict and manage the future. Within these libraries, contradictions were not resolved. Multiple versions of the same myth sat side by side. Flood stories varied. Creation accounts conflicted. This coexistence reflects a worldview comfortable with multiplicity. Authority did not depend on a single narrative, but on access to all of them. Wisdom lay in comparison, not elimination. Divination texts reveal how deeply this mindset penetrated daily life. Every event carried potential meaning. The liver of a sacrificed sheep, marked with unusual features, could reveal divine intention. The flight of birds, patterns of smoke, or dreams reported by commoners were recorded and interpreted. These practices did not eliminate fear. They structured it. Anxiety became manageable through procedure. Medicine followed similar principles. Illness was rarely attributed to chance alone. It resulted from imbalance, impurity, or divine displeasure. Treatments combined practical remedies with incantations. Herbs and poultices addressed symptoms, while spoken formulas addressed cause. Healing required alignment between body and cosmos. Failure did not discredit the system. It reinforced the belief that forces beyond human control were at work. As empires rose and fell, this cultural framework proved resilient. When Babylon replaced Assyria as regional power, the gods were rearranged again. Marduk rose to supremacy, absorbing attributes of older deities. His elevation reflected political reality rather than theological revelation. Power reshaped divinity, not the reverse. Yet continuity remained. Ritual calendars persisted. Scribal training followed ancient models. The clay tablet endured. Outside Mesopotamia, these ideas traveled. Traders, exiles, and diplomats carried stories into neighboring regions. Flood narratives, divine councils, and creation from Earth appeared in varied forms across the ancient Near East. Each culture adapted them to its own values, but the underlying structures remained recognizable. Memory migrated even as cities burned. One of the most profound shifts occurred when monotheistic traditions emerged. Rather than multiple gods negotiating order, a single deity assumed total authority. Yet even here, Mesopotamian influence lingered. Legal codes echoed earlier formulations. Flood stories retained familiar contours. Wisdom literature reflected the same concerns with mortality and justice. The framework changed, but its foundations persisted. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia itself, environmental strain accumulated. Intensive irrigation gradually salinized soil, reducing yields. Political instability disrupted canal maintenance. Cities shrank. Temples fell into disrepair. As resources dwindled, the elaborate systems designed to manage abundance struggled to adapt to scarcity. Decline did not arrive as sudden catastrophe, but as attrition. When foreign powers conquered the region, they inherited ruins rather than thriving cities. Persians, Greeks, and later empires imposed new administrative models. Cuneiform writing, once the backbone of civilization, became increasingly impractical compared to alphabetic scripts. Scribal schools closed. The last tablets were written for astronomical purposes, preserving sky movements long after gods had faded from daily consciousness. Eventually, the ability to read these texts vanished. The clay tablets remained, but their voices fell silent. Myths that once structured existence became inert artifacts, buried under sand and debris. For centuries, the Anunnaki ceased to exist outside memory embedded in later traditions. Civilization moved on, unaware of its own foundations. The rediscovery of these texts in the modern era reawakened them, but not without distortion. Some sought sensation rather than understanding, transforming gods into extraterrestrials and myths into literal histories. Such interpretations ignored context, stripping the stories of their philosophical depth. The tablets do not describe visitors from the stars. They describe how humans understood power, labor, and survival. What the Anunnaki represent is not external intervention, but internal explanation. They are models for authority, reflections of environmental pressure translated into narrative form. Floods, famines, and social hierarchy become intelligible through divine drama. The gods' flaws mirror human vulnerability. Their conflicts encode systemic tension. In this light, the endurance of Mesopotamian civilization appears less mysterious. It survived because it acknowledged impermanence. Its myths do not promise stability. They explain why stability is temporary. They teach adaptation rather than faith, memory rather than salvation. When the last cuneiform tablet was written, something profound ended. But something else had already succeeded. The idea that knowledge could be preserved, that stories could outlast empires, that order required continuous effort rather than divine guarantee. These concepts had escaped clay. They migrated into other cultures, other systems, other languages. What began as marks pressed into mud became a template for civilization itself. Even as the Anunnaki faded from worship, the world view they articulated persisted. Humans remain builders of fragile systems, dependent on memory, labor, and cooperation. The ancient tablets do not offer escape from this condition. They offer recognition. Civilization is not a gift secured forever. It is work endlessly repeated against the silence waiting beneath. When the old cities thinned and the canals filled with silt, what survived longest was not stone or brick, but habit. Even as empires fractured and languages shifted, people continued to live according to patterns established thousands of years earlier. They rose with the sun, tracked seasons by the sky, negotiated labor through record and oath, and understood misfortune as imbalance rather than accident. The architecture of thought outlived the architecture of cities. This endurance was possible because Mesopotamian civilization had never relied on permanence. From its beginning, it assumed instability. Rivers wandered. Floods erased settlements. Dynasties ended abruptly. The response was not denial, but redundancy. Knowledge was copied, rituals repeated, authority layered. When one structure failed, another absorbed its function. This was not optimism. It was pragmatism shaped by experience. One of the most revealing survivals of this mindset appears in how later cultures remembered the flood. Across regions and centuries, the details change, but the logic remains. Destruction comes not because the world is evil, but because balance fails. Survival depends not on strength, but foresight, obedience to warning, and preparation. The hero is not the conqueror, but the one who listens carefully and acts quietly. This pattern reflects the lived reality of river societies more than theological speculation. In Mesopotamian memory, the flood never became a moral cleansing in the later sense. It remained administrative, almost bureaucratic. A problem of excess met with an extreme solution, later judged as inefficient. This framing strips catastrophe of righteousness and replaces it with consequence. The gods regret their decision not because it was unjust, but because it disrupted the system they depended on. Humanity's value lies not in innocence, but utility. This perspective shaped attitudes toward suffering. Misfortune did not imply personal failure or moral corruption. A farmer whose crops failed might have performed every ritual correctly and still lose everything. The world was not fair, only responsive. One adjusted offerings, sought divination, changed tactics, and continued. Resilience mattered more than explanation. Wisdom literature from Mesopotamia reflects this tone. Texts advise moderation, caution in speech, loyalty to family, and awareness of power dynamics. They do not promise reward for virtue, only reduced risk. Arrogance attracts attention. Silence preserves safety. Generosity strengthens alliances. These are strategies for navigating a volatile environment, not commandments from on high. Even prayer follows this logic. Supplication texts often begin with confusion rather than confidence. The speaker admits ignorance of which God has been offended, which rule broken. Guilt is assumed without clarity. The goal is not absolution, but relief. Suffering is a signal, not a verdict. This uncertainty reinforces humility before forces too complex to fully understand. As writing faded from everyday use, these attitudes persisted orally. Proverbs, customs, and social expectations carried forward assumptions about labor, hierarchy, and obligation. When alphabetic scripts replaced cuneiform, the medium changed but not the message. Contracts still mattered. Authority still required justification. Memory remained essential. In later religious traditions, some of these ideas were transformed rather than erased. The concept of divine law retained Mesopotamian roots, but responsibility shifted inward. Where earlier texts emphasized ritual precision, later ones emphasized intention, yet even here echoes remain. Law as structure, community as stabilizer, history as lesson rather than prophecy. The loss of the old gods did not erase the systems they animated. Temples became palaces, then administrative centers, then symbolic ruins. Kings became emperors, then governors, then officials. The language of divine mandate shifted into secular legitimacy, but the expectation endured. Authority must explain itself, and failure threatens order. Modern rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts revealed how deeply these foundations run. Scholars deciphered wedge-shaped signs and uncovered not primitive superstition, but disciplined thought. The myths are not attempts to escape reality. They are tools for engaging it. They translate environmental pressure into narrative, making chaos manageable through story. The temptation to reinterpret these texts as records of lost technologies or alien intervention misunderstands their purpose. The Anunnaki are not placeholders for unknown forces. They are known forces given form. They represent water that floods without warning, authority that enforces without mercy, wisdom that bends rules to preserve life. They are metaphors sharpened by necessity. What remains striking is the absence of nostalgia in these stories. There is no golden age to which humanity might return. Even the time before the flood is not idealized. It is noisy, excessive, unsustainable. Progress is not a return, but an adjustment. Each era inherits problems from the last and applies new constraints. Civilization advances sideways rather than upward. This acceptance of limitation may be Mesopotamia's most enduring contribution. It rejects the idea of final solutions. Every structure requires maintenance. Every law invites exception. Every success creates new vulnerabilities. The gods themselves embody this truth. They are powerful but constrained, authoritative yet dependent. Their failures legitimize human imperfection. In this worldview, meaning is not bestowed, it is constructed. To build a city is to assert order temporarily. To write a tablet is to resist forgetting briefly. To raise children is to extend continuity without guarantee. These acts matter not because they endure forever, but because they push back against collapse for a time. When the last priest stopped dressing a statue, when the last scribe pressed a stylus into clay, the world did not end. It adapted. The systems dissolved into others. But the underlying recognition remained. Existence is negotiated, not promised. The Anunnaki, stripped of worship, survive as ideas embedded in how societies understand power and responsibility. They remind us that civilization is artificial, maintained by effort rather than fate. That authority must be justified, that labor sustains order, that memory is fragile but essential. Long after the rivers changed course and the ziggurats crumbled, these lessons persist. They appear whenever humans confront scarcity, rebuild after disaster, or question the legitimacy of power. They are not relics of a dead world, but reflections of a condition that has not changed. The clay tablets do not whisper secrets of lost gods. They speak plainly about endurance. They show a civilization that knew it could fail and chose to build anyway. In that choice lies their legacy, not as ancestors to be romanticized, but as thinkers who faced instability without illusion and left behind a map for surviving it. When the memory of the Anunnaki faded from ritual practice, it did not vanish from human behavior. The gods were no longer invoked by name in daily offerings, yet the assumptions they embodied continued to shape how societies understood obligation, authority, and failure. Long after temples collapsed, people still behaved as if order were fragile, as if excess invited correction, as if power required explanation. The divine had withdrawn, but its architecture remained. One of the clearest survivals of this architecture appears in how later civilizations treated time. Mesopotamian culture did not imagine history as progress toward perfection. Time was cyclical, punctuated by collapse and renewal. Cities rose, fell, and rose again on the same ground. Calendars tracked repetition rather than novelty. Even kingship was framed as recurring rather than permanent, something that descended, departed, and returned. This perspective discouraged expectation of final stability. The 7-day week, inherited through later cultures, reflects this rhythm. It was not a natural division, but a symbolic one, tied to celestial observation and ritual cycles. Time itself became regulated, broken into units that could be managed, predicted, and repeated. This segmentation allowed coordination across large populations, synchronizing labor, worship, and rest. Even when the gods changed, the structure of time did not. Law, too, carried forward Mesopotamian assumptions. Legal systems increasingly emphasized codification, public record, and precedent. Justice was no longer administered solely through divine appeal, but through documented procedure. This shift did not represent secularization so much as redistribution. Authority moved from temple to institution, from God to office. The logic remained. Order required visible rules and predictable consequences. The concept of guilt also evolved along these lines. In Mesopotamian thought, guilt was often collective and ambiguous. Disaster might result from unknown offense or inherited imbalance. Later traditions individualized responsibility, but the anxiety remained. Humans continued to search for causes behind misfortune, reluctant to accept randomness. Systems of belief arose to fill this need, offering moral explanations where earlier cultures had offered ritual ones. Even the image of the flood transformed. In regions far from rivers, it became symbolic rather than environmental. Water represented cleansing, reset, and boundary. Yet the core idea endured: overwhelming disruption as a corrective force. Societies continued to imagine catastrophe as meaningful rather than meaningless. This impulse did not require literal gods, only the assumption that events followed some intelligible pattern. Urban planning reveals similar continuity. Cities remained organized around central authority, whether palace, forum, or cathedral. Infrastructure preceded aesthetics. Roads, water supply, storage, and defense defined success more than ornament. These priorities echo the earliest Mesopotamian cities, where survival dictated design. Even modern cities unconsciously repeat this template, prioritizing function while embedding symbolism afterward. Education likewise retained its role as preservation rather than exploration. Early scribal schools trained students to copy faithfully, not innovate. This emphasis on mastery before creativity persists in many traditions. Knowledge is treated as inheritance, something received before it can be altered. The fear of error, rooted in ritual consequence, shaped attitudes toward learning long after ritual itself faded. In literature, Mesopotamian themes resurfaced under new names. Heroes faced mortality without promise of escape. Wisdom lay in acceptance rather than triumph. Stories ended not with victory, but with understanding. These narratives resist the fantasy of total control. They affirm limitation as fundamental. Such stories continue to resonate because they reflect lived experience more accurately than myths of invincibility. The disappearance of the Anunnaki from worship did not eliminate the need for intermediaries. Priests gave way to officials, prophets, philosophers. Each claimed access to deeper order, whether divine law, natural reason, or historical inevitability. The form changed, but the function remained. Humans sought figures who could interpret chaos and render it manageable. This continuity explains why rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts was so unsettling to modern readers. They revealed that ideas often considered universal or modern had deep roots in an ancient pragmatic worldview. The fear of overpopulation, the tension between labor and authority, the fragility of ecosystems, the limits of power. These concerns were articulated at civilization's beginning. The Anunnaki myths are not fantasies of transcendence. They are records of constraint. They acknowledge that even gods operate within systems, make errors, and face consequences. This demystification of power is perhaps their most radical feature. Authority is necessary but dangerous. Wisdom lies in balance, not domination. As modern societies grapple with scale, resource strain, and institutional trust, these ancient insights regain relevance. The collapse of complex systems is no longer theoretical. Environmental instability, political fragmentation, and technological excess eco-challenges faced millennia ago. The difference lies in speed, not substance. What Mesopotamian thought offers is not a solution, but a stance. It accepts that civilization requires constant maintenance, that memory must be actively preserved, that forgetting is as destructive as invasion. The clay tablets survived because someone believed copying them mattered, even when their immediate usefulness was unclear. This belief in preservation, without guarantee, underpins all enduring culture. Museums, archives, libraries, and databases perform the same function today. They resist erasure not because the future is assured, but because the present demands effort. The act of remembering becomes ethical. In this sense, the Anunnaki never truly left. They ceased to be worshipped, but their logic embedded itself in how humans organize life. They persist wherever authority is questioned, labor is justified, disaster is interpreted, and memory is defended against loss. Their world was harsh, uncertain, and finite. So is ours. The value of their stories lies not in exotic imagery, but in sober recognition. Civilization is not destiny, it is practice. It survives only as long as people believe it is worth sustaining. The ancient scribes who pressed signs into clay did not expect immortality. They expected continuity, fragile and conditional. That expectation remains the foundation of every society that follows. The Anunnaki fade, but the work continues. As memory carried forward without the gods' names attached, something subtle changed in how humans understood responsibility. In the earliest Mesopotamian imagination, failure belonged to systems rather than individuals. A flood was not someone's fault. It was imbalance made visible. A famine did not indict morality. It exposed fragility. Over time, as divine figures receded into abstraction, this systemic view narrowed. Responsibility condensed, settling more heavily on human shoulders. Authority no longer answered upward. It answered inward. This shift did not happen suddenly. It unfolded across centuries as rituals simplified, priesthoods lost exclusivity, and interpretation replaced sacrifice as the primary means of explaining disorder. When people could no longer appeal directly to Enlil or Enki, they appealed to law, reason, or moral codes that claimed universal reach. The world still needed explanation. The mechanism changed, yet the older framework never fully disappeared. It lingered in the background, shaping assumptions beneath new language. Even when disasters were framed as punishment for sin rather than imbalance, the structure remained familiar. Excess still invited correction. Noise still provoked response. Survival still depended on foresight rather than righteousness alone. The logic of the flood survived even when its cause was rewritten. One of the clearest places this continuity appears is in attitudes toward work. In Mesopotamian myth, labor is not humiliation, but necessity. Humans are created to work because work sustains order. Later traditions often reinterpret labor as punishment or moral trial, yet the practical reality remains unchanged. Societies depend on coordinated effort. Infrastructure must be maintained. Systems decay without input. The moral framing shifts, but the demand persists. This persistence reveals something essential about the Anunnaki narratives. They are not origin stories in the modern sense. They are operating manuals. They describe how complex systems behave under pressure, using gods as shorthand for forces too large to manage directly. When humans later removed the gods from the equation, the forces remained. Consider population. The ancient texts treat overpopulation as a logistical crisis rather than a moral one. Too many people strain resources, increase noise, destabilize order. The solutions proposed are blunt: plague, famine, flood. Modern societies recoil from such measures, yet still confront the same problem. The language is different, but the tension remains unresolved. Technology complicates this further. Mesopotamian civilization expanded within natural limits imposed by rivers and soil. Modern civilization pushes against planetary boundaries with far greater speed and scale. Yet the underlying question is unchanged. How much complexity can a system sustain before it collapses under its own weight? The Anunnaki stories offer no reassurance. They suggest collapse is not only possible, but expected. What distinguishes the ancient response is acceptance. There is no illusion that growth can continue indefinitely. Limits are acknowledged, even if imposed violently. This realism contrasts sharply with later narratives of endless progress. The discomfort modern readers feel when encountering Mesopotamian myths often stems from this refusal to console. The stories do not promise rescue. They explain consequence. Another enduring element is the role of mediation. In the earliest cities, priests mediated between humans and gods. Kings mediated between divine order and human action. Scribes mediated between past and present. Each role existed because direct access to meaning was impossible. Someone had to interpret signals, maintain continuity, and enforce boundaries. As societies evolved, these roles transformed rather than vanished. Priests became theologians, kings became legislators. Scribes became archivists, scholars, bureaucrats. The need for mediation did not diminish. It intensified as systems grew more complex. The loss of divine voices did not produce clarity. It produced more layers of interpretation. This multiplication of intermediaries creates its own instability. Authority fragments, competing explanations emerge. Without a shared cosmology, coherence becomes fragile. Mesopotamian civilization avoided this fragmentation for centuries by tolerating contradiction. Multiple gods, multiple myths, multiple explanations coexisted. Uniformity was not required for order. Modern systems often demand coherence. Single narratives dominate. Deviations are treated as threats rather than alternatives. This rigidity may explain why collapse feels more catastrophic now. When one explanation fails, there is no backup. The Mesopotamian approach, though less tidy, proved resilient. The Anunnaki myths also challenge the idea that knowledge naturally accumulates toward truth. In these stories, knowledge is dangerous. Enki's wisdom saves humanity, but undermines authority. Inanna's acquisition of the me empowers her city, but destabilizes balance. Information redistributes power. It always has. The fear of knowledge is not superstition. It is political realism. This tension persists today. Access to information empowers individuals while threatening centralized control. Systems respond with regulation, surveillance, or restriction. The ancient myths already recognized this dynamic. Wisdom is necessary, but it disrupts hierarchy. Order requires ignorance, but ignorance invites catastrophe. There is no stable resolution. Perhaps this is why the Anunnaki were never portrayed as benevolent overseers. They are conflicted, divided, and often wrong. They represent systems under strain, not ideals to be worshipped. Their failures legitimize human struggle. If even gods miscalculate, collapse is not shameful. It is structural. This perspective offers a stark contrast to narratives that frame failure as personal inadequacy. Mesopotamian thought resists that conclusion. Individuals act within constraints they did not design. Responsibility exists, but it is bounded. Blame does not restore balance. Adaptation does. The rediscovered tablets force modern readers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Civilization has always been an experiment with uncertain outcomes. There is no final stage, no perfected system waiting ahead. There is only maintenance, revision, and memory. In this sense, the Anunnaki myths are not ancient curiosities. They are mirrors. They reflect a world that understood its own precarity and chose to build anyway. Not because success was guaranteed, but because order, however temporary, was preferable to silence. The gods fade. The labor remains. The tablets endure not because they are sacred, but because someone believed remembering mattered more than forgetting. That belief, more than any deity, is what carries civilization forward. When writing finally loosened its grip on clay and migrated into other forms, something fundamental shifted in how humans related to memory. Clay had demanded effort, time, and intention. Each tablet required preparation, precision, and patience. Writing was slow, deliberate, and therefore selective. When that constraint disappeared, memory expanded, but it also thinned. What could be recorded easily could also be forgotten easily. The Mesopotamian world had treated memory as weight. Later worlds treated it as volume. This transition reshaped the relationship between past and present. In the earliest cities, the past was authoritative because it was scarce. A text survived only if generations deemed it worth copying. Survival itself implied value. By contrast, when records multiplied, selection weakened. Authority no longer came from endurance alone, but from interpretation. meaning drifted away from origin and toward argument. Yet the older instinct persisted beneath the surface. Even as societies accumulated vast archives, they continued to treat certain texts as foundational. These texts functioned much like the ancient tablets once did, anchoring identity and order. They were cited not merely for information, but for legitimacy. To appeal to the past was to stabilize the present. This is where the Anunnaki myths exerted their quiet influence. They framed history not as linear ascent, but as oscillation. Creation followed by excess followed by correction followed by rebuilding. This cycle discouraged the belief that any system could permanently solve the problem of disorder. Instead, it emphasized vigilance. Stability was something maintained, not achieved. Political power absorbed this lesson unevenly. Some rulers embraced the idea that authority required restraint. Others interpreted divine precedent as justification for total control. Both readings found support in ancient texts. The gods punished noise, but they also regretted destruction. They enforced order, but they relied on those they ruled. Power was effective only when balanced. This ambiguity is why Mesopotamian mythology resisted simplification. It never collapsed into a single moral lesson. The flood was not a triumph of justice. Creation was not an act of love. Humanity was not central. These stories decentered the human perspective, placing it within a system larger than individual desire or virtue. That decentering remains unsettling. Modern societies often resist this discomfort. They prefer narratives that affirm purpose, progress, or redemption. Mesopotamian thought offers none of these. It offers explanation without consolation. The world exists. It is unstable. Humans labor within it. Meaning arises from participation, not destiny. This stance shaped how failure was processed. When cities fell, their destruction was recorded, lamented, and integrated into collective memory. Lamentation was not denial, it was acknowledgement. By naming loss, communities preserved continuity even in ruin. The city might vanish, but its story endured. Such texts do not ask for restoration. They accept irreversibility. This acceptance does not imply passivity. Rebuilding followed. New cities rose on old ground, names were reused, rituals resumed. But the memory of collapse remained embedded in culture, tempering expectation. In contrast, cultures that imagine history as irreversible progress struggle to absorb failure. Collapse becomes anomaly rather than pattern. Recovery becomes miracle rather than process. The Mesopotamian approach normalizes breakdown. It does not glorify it, but it does not treat it as incomprehensible. The Anunnaki myths also complicate ideas of freedom. Humans are created to work, constrained by design. Yet within those constraints, they innovate, form relationships, and leave legacies. Freedom is not absence of limitation. It is navigation within it. This conception avoids the false promise of total autonomy, replacing it with realistic agency. This perspective resonates strongly in moments of crisis. When systems fail, individuals often discover that choice exists only within narrow margins. The ancient texts do not romanticize this condition. They acknowledge frustration and grief. But they do not interpret limitation as injustice. It is the starting point. Even the gods experience limitation. They cannot undo the flood. They cannot escape dependency on human offerings. They cannot agree among themselves. This portrayal strips divinity of absoluteness. Power is contextual, relational, and fragile. Such a view undermines any claim to infallible authority. This is perhaps why later traditions struggled with Mesopotamian material. The refusal to assign ultimate moral clarity conflicted with emerging frameworks that demanded it. As a result, older myths were absorbed selectively. Elements that supported new doctrines survived. Others were muted or reinterpreted, yet fragments persisted. The image of a divine council debating fate, the notion of humanity formed from earth, the idea that wisdom can save but also disrupt. These motifs recur because they reflect structural realities. They are not inventions of belief, but observations encoded in story. The decline of cuneiform literacy did not erase these observations. They migrated into new languages, symbols, and institutions. Legal reasoning retained its procedural focus. Science inherited the emphasis on observation and record. History adopted the role of warning rather than prophecy. What was lost, perhaps, was the humility embedded in the original framework. As gods vanished, humans increasingly placed themselves at the center. Control replaced balance as the dominant aspiration. Mastery replaced maintenance. This shift brought unprecedented capability, but also new vulnerabilities. The Mesopotamian worldview would not be surprised by this outcome. It anticipates overreach. It assumes that complexity generates instability. It warns, quietly but persistently, that systems collapse not because they are evil, but because they grow beyond their capacity to sustain themselves. The Anunnaki myths do not demand belief. They demand attention. They ask the reader to recognize patterns that repeat regardless of ideology. They insist that civilization is provisional, that memory requires effort, that power must be constrained, that loss is not failure, but condition. In a world saturated with information yet fragile in coherence, these ancient insights regain urgency. The problem they address has not changed. Only the scale has. Clay tablets once carried these lessons across millennia. Now they surface in different forms, often unrecognized, shaping decisions and assumptions. The gods are gone, but the logic they embodied remains embedded in how humans confront uncertainty. Civilization continues not because it has solved the problem of disorder, but because it has learned, again and again, to live with it. That lesson, pressed into clay by anonymous hands, remains one of the most durable inheritances humanity possesses. By the time the last great Mesopotamian cities began to thin into ruins, the most powerful inheritance they left behind was not stone, law, or myth, but a way of perceiving limits. Long before later civilizations spoke of sustainability or collapse, the people of the river plains understood that every system carries within it the seeds of its own failure. Their gods were not symbols of salvation, but instruments for thinking through that reality, giving shape to forces that could not be controlled but had to be acknowledged. In the earliest texts, authority exists because disorder is inevitable. Kings are needed because coordination does not arise naturally. Laws are written because memory alone is unreliable. Gods intervene because nature does not negotiate. None of these institutions are celebrated as perfect. They are presented as necessary responses to an environment that resists stability. This is the logic that quietly underpins everything that follows. As later societies inherited Mesopotamian knowledge without its mythological language, the logic survived while its symbolism eroded. Authority remained necessary, but its justification shifted. Instead of divine mandate, rulers appealed to destiny, reason, or popular will. Yet the same tension persisted beneath the surface. Power still required restraint. Systems still failed when stretched too far. Only the vocabulary had changed. This loss of shared symbolic language made failure harder to interpret. In Mesopotamian thought, collapse was expected. It demanded response, not denial. Floods destroyed cities, and cities were rebuilt elsewhere. Dynasties ended, and kingship descended again. The cycle was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was structural. Later cultures, lacking this cyclical frame, increasingly treated collapse as aberration. Something had gone wrong. Someone had failed. This personalization of failure introduced moral intensity where earlier cultures had practiced adjustment. Blame replaced balance. Responsibility narrowed instead of diffusing across systems. The result was often paralysis. When no single culprit could explain collapse, explanation itself fractured. The ancient approach avoided this trap by assigning failure to imbalance rather than guilt. The Anunnaki embody this principle. They are not judges weighing virtue. They are managers responding to overload. Humanity grows too numerous, too loud, too complex, and the system reacts. The reaction is brutal, but not moral. It is corrective. When the correction overshoots, the gods regret it, not because it was evil, but because it disrupted the system they depended on. This is a profoundly unsentimental view of power. Modern readers often find this unsettling because it offers no moral comfort. Suffering is not ennobling. Survival is not guaranteed. Wisdom does not prevent loss. It only improves the odds. Yet this clarity is precisely what allowed Mesopotamian civilization to endure for thousands of years. It did not promise permanence. It practiced resilience. That resilience was built into institutions. Grain storage assumed famine. Legal codes assumed conflict. Divination assumed uncertainty. Writing assumed forgetting. Every structure compensated for expected failure. Redundancy was not wasteful. It was survival strategy. When one canal failed, another diverted water. When one city fell, another absorbed refugees. Continuity emerged from flexibility, not rigidity. As civilization expanded beyond river valleys into empires spanning continents, this flexibility diminished. Centralization favored efficiency over redundancy. Uniformity replaced variation. Systems grew powerful but brittle. When failure arrived, it cascaded. The ancient warnings embedded in myth no longer restrained ambition. Growth became its own justification. Yet material reality continued to enforce limits. Soil exhausted, climate shifted, resources strained. Empires collapsed under pressures they could not manage. The difference was not in outcome, but in interpretation. Without gods to externalize systemic stress, societies struggled to articulate why collapse occurred. They reached for ideology, conspiracy, or nostalgia. The Mesopotamian worldview offers a different lens. It suggests that collapse is not anomaly, but phase. That systems oscillate between order and disorder. That maintenance, not mastery, sustains complexity. This perspective does not diminish human agency. It clarifies its boundaries. Within this framework, meaning arises not from success, but from participation. To labor is not to suffer meaninglessly, but to contribute to balance. To record is not to chase immortality, but to preserve continuity. To govern is not to dominate, but to coordinate under constraint. These roles are imperfect by design, because perfection would eliminate adaptability. The Anunnaki myths encode this philosophy without abstraction. They dramatize it through conflict, regret, and compromise. The gods do not triumph over chaos. They negotiate with it. They fail, adjust, and continue. Humanity, created to bear labor, inherits this pattern. Humans work not to escape disorder, but to delay it. This insight remains relevant precisely because modern systems have outgrown the myths that once carried it. Technology accelerates feedback loops. Global networks amplify imbalance. The illusion of control intensifies vulnerability. In this context, the ancient acceptance of limits becomes radical again. The rediscovered tablets do not instruct modern societies what to do. They remind them what they are: builders of provisional structures, managers of fragile systems, keepers of memory against erasure. Their value lies not in prediction, but in recognition. When the Anunnaki vanished from worship, humanity did not outgrow their logic. It internalized it, often without realizing. Every debate about growth, authority, responsibility, and collapse echoes questions first asked beside unpredictable rivers. Every effort to preserve knowledge against loss reenacts the labor of scribes pressing signs into clay. Civilization has always been an act of defiance against impermanence, undertaken without guarantee. The Mesopotamians understood this from the beginning. They did not believe the world was kind. They believed it was manageable briefly through effort, memory, and restraint. That belief built cities, laws, literature, and science. It survived floods, famines, and empires. It survives still whenever humans choose maintenance over denial, adaptation over purity, remembrance over forgetting. The Anunnaki are no longer named, but the work they symbolized continues. Order remains temporary. Balance remains negotiated. Civilization remains unfinished, and as long as humans remember this, the ancient voice pressed into clay has not gone silent. As the long arc of Mesopotamian civilization receded into layered ruin, what remained most intact was not its architecture or pantheon, but its instinct for reading the world as a system of pressures rather than a stage for moral drama. Later cultures inherited fragments of this instinct, often without realizing their origin. They spoke of fate, fortune, necessity, or natural law, but beneath the vocabulary lay the same recognition. Events emerge from interaction, not intention alone. This recognition shaped how power was understood even when gods no longer stood at the center. Authority became something to be justified through results rather than lineage. A ruler who failed to maintain stability lost legitimacy, regardless of ritual correctness. Prosperity signaled alignment. Disaster implied mismanagement. The logic was old, merely translated into new forms. Governance was still judged by its ability to coordinate labor, manage resources, and absorb shock. In Mesopotamia, this coordination had always been visible. Canals could be inspected, storehouses counted, records checked. Failure was tangible. As societies grew more abstract, consequences became harder to trace. Economic systems stretched across distances. Decisions rippled invisibly. Responsibility blurred. The ancient clarity of cause and effect weakened, replaced by complexity that resisted attribution. Yet the human response remained consistent. Faced with uncertainty, people sought explanation. Where Mesopotamians consulted diviners, later cultures consulted philosophers, theologians, economists, and scientists. Each discipline offered models for interpreting imbalance. None eliminated it. Each provided tools for anticipation rather than control. The Mesopotamian contribution lies in its refusal to collapse explanation into certainty. Divination did not promise accuracy, it offered orientation. Omens were ambiguous by design. They required judgment. This ambiguity prevented overconfidence. It acknowledged that interpretation was provisional, always subject to revision by events. Modern systems often struggle with this humility. Predictive models promise precision. Forecasts claim authority. When they fail, trust erodes. The ancient approach anticipated failure as inherent. No single sign or model could capture the whole. Wisdom lay in triangulation, not dominance of one explanation. This attitude also shaped how Mesopotamians viewed innovation. New tools, techniques, and practices were adopted cautiously, integrated into existing frameworks rather than celebrated as disruption. Change was tolerated, even necessary, but it was never assumed to be improvement by default. Every alteration introduced risk. This caution slowed progress, but enhanced survivability. Contrast this with later narratives that equate novelty with advancement. Such narratives accelerate transformation without proportional investment in maintenance. Systems evolve faster than their capacity to absorb error. When collapse follows, it is treated as betrayal rather than outcome. The Anunnaki myths encode this caution through divine conflict. Enki's innovations save humanity, but undermine Enlil's order. Inanna's ambition enriches her city, but destabilizes equilibrium. Creativity is powerful and dangerous. It expands possibility while increasing volatility. The gods themselves cannot resolve this tension. They manage it imperfectly. Humans inherit the same dilemma. Innovation extends reach but amplifies consequence. The Mesopotamian worldview does not reject creativity. It contextualizes it. Every gain carries cost. Every solution generates new problems. Awareness of this dynamic tempers excess. Another enduring element is the treatment of silence and noise. In the myths, humanity's noise disturbs the gods. This detail is often misunderstood as trivial. It is not about sound. It is about systemic load. Noise represents activity exceeding capacity, signals overwhelming control mechanisms. When systems cannot rest, they fail. Modern parallels abound. Information overload, constant connectivity, and perpetual production strain attention and infrastructure. Systems designed for periodic input struggle under continuous demand. The ancient metaphor remains apt. Silence, rest, and limitation are not luxuries. They are stabilizers. Mesopotamian ritual cycles enforced this principle. Festivals punctuated labor. Sabbaths of a sort interrupted routine. Time was structured to prevent exhaustion of system and individual alike. These pauses were not indulgent, they were preventive. Later traditions inherited versions of this practice, often stripped of its original rationale. The decline of such rhythms contributes to instability. When activity becomes constant, error accumulates. Correction arrives abruptly rather than gradually. The flood replaces the controlled release of pressure. Ancient stories warn against this pattern not through abstraction, but through narrative consequence. The endurance of these stories suggests they articulate something fundamental. Humans persist in environments that exceed their control. They build systems to manage uncertainty. Those systems fail. Survival depends not on eliminating failure, but on anticipating and absorbing it. Mesopotamian civilization institutionalized this anticipation. It expected loss, it planned for it, it mourned it, and then it rebuilt. This cycle was not romanticized, it was endured. As modern societies confront accelerating change, this ancient posture regains relevance. The temptation to seek final solutions remains strong. The Mesopotamian texts caution against it. They depict a world where even gods cannot secure permanence. Stability is temporary by nature. Meaning, then, is not found in victory over chaos, but in engagement with it. To manage rather than conquer, to adapt rather than perfect, to remember rather than erase. These values are not heroic, they are durable. The Anunnaki myths survive because they articulate this durability without sentiment. They do not flatter humanity. They do not promise transcendence. They describe a shared condition between gods and mortals, dependence within systems larger than themselves. In acknowledging this condition, Mesopotamian civilization achieved something rare. It aligned expectation with reality. It built institutions that mirrored environmental truth. It accepted limitation without surrender. That alignment allowed it to endure long after individual cities vanished. Its ideas migrated, reshaped, embedded in new languages and structures. They persist wherever humans recognize that complexity demands humility. The clay tablets may crumble, but the logic impressed into them continues to surface. It speaks whenever societies confront imbalance and choose response over denial. It reminds that civilization is not a destination, but a practice, fragile, repeatable, and always unfinished. As the echoes of Mesopotamian thought traveled outward and forward in time, they encountered societies that would reinterpret them through new moral and philosophical lenses. Yet beneath these reinterpretations, the original structure remained visible, like a foundation buried beneath newer buildings. Ideas about duty, authority, labor, and collapse were not discarded. They were reframed, often without acknowledgement, because they continued to describe reality with uncomfortable accuracy. One of the most persistent inheritances is the notion that order must be actively produced. In Mesopotamian culture, order did not exist naturally. It was the result of effort applied against entropy. Canals had to be cleared, boundaries enforced, records kept, rituals repeated. When these actions stopped, disorder returned quickly and decisively. This assumption shaped later legal and political systems that treat stability as an achievement rather than a default state. In many subsequent traditions, order was described as divinely ordained or naturally emergent, yet the mechanisms that sustained it remained deeply Mesopotamian. Bureaucracies replaced temples, archives replaced sanctuaries, administrators replaced priests. The language changed, but the function did not. Someone still had to count, measure, allocate, and correct. Civilization remained a technical project. This technical view of society contrasts sharply with romantic ideas of human community as organic or self-regulating. The ancient texts offer no such comfort. They assume friction, conflict, and scarcity as constants. Cooperation is not spontaneous, it is organized. Justice is not inherent, it is imposed. Peace is not permanent, it is maintained. These assumptions may appear cynical, but they are grounded in observation rather than ideology. Another enduring influence lies in how responsibility is distributed. Mesopotamian systems diffused responsibility across institutions rather than isolating it within individuals. A failed harvest implicated administrators, ritual specialists, laborers, and environmental forces simultaneously. This diffusion reduced the impulse to scapegoat. Failure was collective, and so was recovery. As societies later emphasized individual accountability, this collective framing weakened. Responsibility narrowed, often unfairly, producing cycles of blame that obscured systemic causes. The ancient approach did not absolve individuals of duty, but it resisted the idea that outcomes could be traced to singular faults. Complexity demanded shared burden. The myths reflect this sensibility clearly. When disasters strike, even the gods share blame. Councils argue, decisions are questioned, regret is acknowledged, authority is not absolute, it is negotiated. This portrayal undermines simplistic hierarchies. Power is necessary, but it is always partial. The underworld mythology reinforces this realism. There is no final reckoning where balance is restored. Justice must occur among the living, or not at all. This belief places ethical urgency in the present. Actions matter because they shape immediate conditions, not because they secure future reward. Such a framework discourages postponement of responsibility. As these ideas filtered into later cultures, they were often softened. Concepts of moral recompense after death offered consolation. Yet even these systems retained traces of the older logic. Laws still governed life. Consequences still unfolded in real time. The promise of later justice did not eliminate the need for present order. The Mesopotamian emphasis on memory as defense against chaos also persisted. Writing, archiving, and historiography remained central to governance. Records were not kept merely for curiosity, but to prevent repetition of error. Forgetting was dangerous. It invited the return of conditions that had already proven destructive. This awareness shaped early historical writing, which often framed events as lessons rather than narratives of progress. Rise and fall were treated as instructive cycles. Success contained warnings. Failure contained knowledge. History was a tool, not a celebration. Modern attitudes toward history frequently oscillate between glorification and dismissal. The Mesopotamian approach avoids both extremes. It treats the past as resource. What happened before matters because it reveals patterns, not because it confers prestige or shame. This pragmatic stance allows adaptation without illusion. Another subtle inheritance appears in how societies manage uncertainty. The Mesopotamians did not seek to eliminate uncertainty. They sought to live with it intelligently. Divination, ritual, and record-keeping did not promise certainty. They offered orientation. This distinction is critical. Orientation allows response without false confidence. Contemporary systems often confuse prediction with control. When predictions fail, trust collapses. The ancient model anticipated failure. It incorporated revision as normal. Omens could be reinterpreted, decisions adjusted. Error did not discredit the system. It activated it. This tolerance for ambiguity may be one of the most valuable lost skills. In a world that demands clarity and speed, ambiguity feels intolerable. Yet complex systems produce ambiguity by nature. Denying it does not reduce it. It merely blinds those navigating it. The Anunnaki myths embody this acceptance. They do not resolve tensions between authority and compassion, innovation and stability, growth and restraint. They stage them. The stories end not with solutions, but with arrangements that hold temporarily. This openness resists closure. As modern narratives strive for resolution, they risk erasing the very dynamics that sustain resilience. Closure implies finality. Mesopotamian thought rejects finality. It assumes continuation under altered conditions. This assumption fosters preparedness rather than disappointment. Even the end of Mesopotamian civilization fits this pattern. It did not vanish in a single moment. It thinned, fragmented, and transformed. Its ideas migrated, its practices adapted, its language died, but its logic survived embedded in other systems. This survival was not accidental. It occurred because the ideas addressed enduring realities. Humans still depend on labor to sustain order, still struggle with authority, still face limits imposed by environment and complexity, still require memory to navigate these challenges. The Anunnaki, as figures, are no longer necessary to convey these truths, but the truths themselves remain. Civilization still exists on provisional ground. Stability still demands effort. Collapse still follows neglect. These conditions are not ancient. They are permanent. By recognizing this permanence, Mesopotamian thought offers a kind of intellectual sobriety. It does not inspire utopian hope or apocalyptic fear. It encourages attentiveness. Watch the systems, maintain them, expect strain, prepare for repair. This sobriety may lack drama, but it supports endurance. It allows societies to persist without self-deception. It frames survival as achievement without mythologizing it. In a sense, it teaches how to live without guarantees. The clay tablets that preserved these ideas did not need to promise transcendence. They needed only to remember. And in remembering, they passed forward a way of seeing the world that remains relevant wherever humans build, govern, and attempt to sustain order against the steady pull of disorder. When the myths of Mesopotamia are stripped of their names and symbols, what remains is a quiet but relentless insistence on accountability to reality. Not moral accountability in the later sense, but structural accountability. Actions produce consequences. Systems respond to stress. No authority, divine or human, stands outside this exchange. This principle, articulated thousands of years ago, continues to surface whenever societies confront the limits of their own constructions. In the ancient worldview, the environment was not a backdrop, but an active participant. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Soil could nourish or poison crops depending on how it was treated. Climate shifted without warning. These forces were not romanticized. They were negotiated with through labor, ritual, and planning. Failure to account for them did not inspire outrage. It resulted in loss. Survival depended on attentiveness rather than belief. This attentiveness shaped social organization. Cooperation was not optional. Large-scale irrigation required synchronized effort across households and generations. Individual autonomy existed, but it was secondary to collective maintenance. Freedom was exercised within constraints imposed by shared dependency. This balance prevented both total domination and unchecked individualism. It was imperfect, but functional. As later societies inherited Mesopotamian ideas, this balance often tilted. Individual aspiration gained prominence. Collective obligation became abstract. Yet the underlying dependency did not disappear. Infrastructure still required coordination. Resources still demanded management. The tension between personal desire and systemic necessity intensified rather than resolved. The Anunnaki myths articulate this tension without apology. Humans are created to serve because service sustains the system. Yet service does not erase humanity. People love, grieve, create, and remember. The texts do not frame this arrangement as ideal or cruel. They present it as condition. To exist within civilization is to contribute to its maintenance. This framing resists both victimhood and triumphalism. Humans are neither exalted nor degraded. They are positioned. Their value lies not in origin or destiny, but in function. This perspective may appear harsh, but it avoids illusions that later cultures struggle to reconcile with experience. The gods themselves operate under similar constraints. They debate, err, and compromise. Their power is real but limited. They depend on offerings, obedience, and cooperation. Without humans, they weaken. This reciprocity undermines absolute hierarchy. Power flows in multiple directions, binding rulers and ruled into mutual dependence. This mutual dependence shapes ethics. Loyalty matters because betrayal destabilizes networks. Generosity matters because surplus smooths volatility. Moderation matters because excess attracts corrective force. These values are not preached, they are implied by consequence. Ethics emerges from observation rather than command. As these ideas traveled into later philosophical traditions, they were often reframed as virtues or laws, yet their origin lies in pragmatism. They worked because they reduced risk. The Mesopotamian worldview does not ask whether actions are good in an abstract sense. It asks whether they preserve balance. The persistence of this logic can be seen in how societies respond to crisis. When faced with systemic failure, communities often rediscover collective responsibility. Mutual aid emerges. Resources are shared. Coordination intensifies. These responses echo ancient survival strategies. They are not innovations, they are reactivations. The difficulty arises when crisis passes. The memory of dependency fades. Individual accumulation resumes. Systems drift toward imbalance again. The cycle repeats. Mesopotamian texts do not condemn this pattern. They record it. They assume forgetting is part of the cycle, just as remembrance is. This is why writing was so central. Writing externalized memory, making forgetting more difficult. It did not prevent collapse, but it preserved lessons. The existence of a record meant that failure could be studied rather than mythologized. The past became resource rather than burden. Modern societies produce unprecedented quantities of record, yet often lack shared frameworks for interpreting them. Information accumulates faster than meaning. Without selection, memory loses its regulatory function. The ancient limitation of record enforced discernment. Only what mattered was preserved. This selectivity did not eliminate bias, but it focused attention. Myths survived because they encoded patterns, not because they entertained. Laws endured because they organized behavior, not because they inspired admiration. Records mattered because they constrained repetition of error. The Anunnaki myths, in this light, function as compressed systems analysis. They describe feedback loops between population, labor, authority, and environment. They model interventions and unintended consequences. They acknowledge trade-offs. They resist finality. Modern systems analysis often arrives at similar conclusions through abstraction. The ancient approach reached them through story. Both recognize that complex systems cannot be controlled absolutely. They can only be guided, corrected, and adapted. The discomfort these stories evoke stems from their refusal to grant exemption. Neither gods nor humans escape consequence. Power amplifies responsibility rather than dissolving it. This principle challenges any ideology that promises immunity to scale, status, or belief. As humanity faces global challenges that mirror ancient ones in intensified form, this principle regains relevance. Environmental limits, resource distribution, population pressure, and systemic risk are not new problems. They are ancient problems at new scale. The Mesopotamian worldview does not offer optimism or despair. It offers orientation. Pay attention. Maintain what sustains you. Expect failure. Prepare for repair. Remember what has already happened. In this sense, the Anunnaki myths are not relics of superstition, but artifacts of early systems thinking. They translate observation into narrative, making complexity intelligible without simplifying it away. They teach without promising mastery. Civilization, as portrayed in these texts, is not a march toward perfection. It is an ongoing negotiation with instability. Its success is measured not by permanence, but by duration. To last is to adapt. The ancient scribes who preserved these stories understood this. They did not write for immortality. They wrote for continuity. They pressed signs into clay, knowing the clay would crack, but hoping the pattern would survive. That hope has been realized repeatedly. Even as names and symbols change, the underlying logic resurfaces. Humans continue to build fragile systems and seek ways to sustain them. They continue to confront limits and search for balance. The Anunnaki may no longer be invoked, but the world they described has not disappeared. It remains a place where order is constructed, not given, where collapse is possible, not exceptional, where meaning arises from participation rather than promise. In remembering this, modern societies do not return to the past. They recover a lens that has always been available, waiting beneath layers of newer belief. A lens that does not flatter, but endures. As the accumulated weight of history presses forward into the present, one of the most revealing legacies of Mesopotamian thought is its treatment of power as something provisional rather than absolute. In the earliest texts, power is never self-justifying. It exists to perform a function, and when it fails to do so, it invites correction, resistance, or collapse. This principle applies equally to gods, kings, and institutions. Authority is tolerated only so long as it sustains balance. The Anunnaki myths encode this principle with unusual clarity. Enlil commands, but his commands provoke unintended consequences. Enki intervenes, but his interventions undermine hierarchy. Inanna acquires power, but her ambition destabilizes equilibrium. None of these figures is condemned outright. None is vindicated fully. Power is depicted as a force that must be constantly recalibrated rather than obeyed blindly. This portrayal stands in contrast to later traditions that sacralize authority or treat it as inherently righteous. In Mesopotamian thought, even divine authority is suspect. Councils debate, decisions are reversed, oaths are circumvented through clever interpretation. The gods themselves must live with the outcomes of their choices. This narrative structure teaches caution, not reverence. When human rulers adopted this framework, it shaped expectations of governance. Kings were praised not for moral purity, but for competence. Maintaining canals, securing harvests, and protecting cities mattered more than personal virtue. Failure in these tasks weakened legitimacy, regardless of ritual correctness. Rule was judged by effect, not intention. This emphasis on outcome over motive has profound implications. It discourages ideological rigidity. A policy that causes famine cannot be defended by appeal to principle alone. The environment provides feedback. Ignoring it invites disaster. Mesopotamian culture accepted this feedback as final. Debate ended when crops failed. Modern societies often struggle with this acceptance. Ideologies persist despite contradictory evidence. Failure is reframed rather than addressed. Responsibility disperses into abstraction. The ancient worldview offers a harsher but clearer metric. Systems either work or they do not. Survival is the measure. Another enduring element lies in the treatment of scale. Mesopotamian texts are acutely aware that problems intensify as systems grow. What functions at village level breaks at city scale. What works for one city destabilizes a network of cities. Expansion multiplies coordination costs. The gods themselves struggle with scale, overwhelmed by humanity's growth and noise. This awareness tempers ambition. Growth is not assumed to be beneficial. It is treated as risk. Later cultures often inverted this assumption, equating growth with success. The consequences of this inversion become visible when systems outpace their capacity to manage complexity. The ancient response to scale was segmentation. City-states retained autonomy while sharing culture and trade. Authority remained distributed. When empires emerged, they did so by layering control rather than replacing local systems entirely. This layering allowed partial failure without total collapse. As centralization increased, resilience decreased. Empires fell harder than city-states because their systems lacked redundancy. Mesopotamian history records this pattern repeatedly. Rise is gradual, collapse is abrupt. The lesson is implicit but consistent. The Anunnaki myths mirror this dynamic. The gods attempt centralized solutions to systemic problems and create greater instability. The flood is the ultimate centralized intervention. Its aftermath reveals the cost of such measures. Control without sensitivity produces regret and dependency. This narrative functions as caution rather than condemnation. It does not deny the necessity of intervention. It warns against excess. Authority must remain responsive, adaptable, and aware of its own limits. When it ceases to listen, it accelerates collapse. Another significant legacy lies in the treatment of knowledge. In Mesopotamian culture, knowledge is powerful but dangerous. Enki's wisdom saves humanity but undermines order. Knowledge redistributes power, eroding established hierarchies. This ambivalence persists across cultures. Education empowers, but it also destabilizes. The ancient response was not suppression, but containment. Knowledge was mediated through institutions. Scribes were trained rigorously. Access was controlled. This limited chaos while preserving continuity. It slowed dissemination but prevented fragmentation. Modern societies often abandon containment in favor of openness, assuming that access itself guarantees benefit. The resulting volatility echoes ancient warnings. Information without structure amplifies noise. Systems struggle to adapt. Authority loses coherence. The Mesopotamian solution was not perfect, but it recognized the trade-off. Stability required friction. Speed increased risk. These insights are rarely articulated explicitly, yet they surface repeatedly in ancient texts through story rather than instruction. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this worldview is its emotional restraint. The myths acknowledge suffering without dramatizing it. Grief is present, but it does not become spectacle. Loss is recorded, not aestheticized. This restraint reflects an understanding that exaggeration distorts response. Clarity matters more than intensity. Modern narratives often invert this priority. Emotion drives attention. Attention drives action. Action is reactive rather than considered. The Mesopotamian approach privileges deliberation over immediacy. Councils meet. Omens are interpreted. Decisions are weighed. Even gods pause. This deliberative pace is not hesitation. It is recognition that haste compounds error. When systems are complex, speed magnifies consequence. Slowness becomes a form of intelligence. The disappearance of this patience contributes to instability. Rapid decision-making without systemic awareness reproduces ancient mistakes at accelerated pace. The Anunnaki myths warn against this without moralizing it. They show what happens when impatience governs power. The relevance of these stories lies not in their antiquity, but in their accuracy. They describe dynamics that persist regardless of technology or ideology. Power accumulates, complexity grows, systems strain, corrections overshoot, regret follows, adaptation resumes. Civilization continues through this cycle, not by escaping it. The Mesopotamians accepted this. They did not seek final answers. They sought workable arrangements. Their myths are not blueprints, but diagnostics. By reading these texts carefully, one encounters a civilization that refused comforting illusions. It did not believe the world was just. It believed it was manageable, temporarily, through effort and attention. That belief sustained it longer than many later cultures that promised more. The Anunnaki stand as reminders that authority, knowledge, and growth are forces to be handled carefully. They are neither saviors nor villains. They are pressures given form. In recognizing them, Mesopotamian culture recognized itself. That recognition remains available. It does not require belief in ancient gods. It requires honesty about limits. Where that honesty exists, systems endure longer. Where it does not, collapse arrives faster. The ancient texts do not command reverence. They offer orientation. They point toward a way of seeing power not as entitlement, but as responsibility within constraint. A way of seeing civilization not as destiny, but as labor. In that orientation lies their lasting value, not as myth, but as memory sharpened into insight, waiting to be recognized again. As the long thread of Mesopotamian influence stretches toward its quiet conclusion, one final pattern emerges with striking clarity: the refusal to separate civilization from responsibility. In the ancient imagination, there is no version of society that operates independently of consequence. Every structure, every hierarchy, every innovation creates pressure somewhere else. This awareness does not disappear with the gods. It migrates, becoming harder to see but no less active. The Anunnaki myths close no story neatly. They leave systems in motion rather than resolved. Humanity survives the flood, but at a cost. Kingship is established, but instability remains. Knowledge expands, but so does risk. This open-endedness is deliberate. It mirrors lived reality more faithfully than any promise of completion. Civilization does not end. It continues under altered conditions. This continuity reframes the idea of legacy. In Mesopotamian thought, legacy is not personal immortality or moral triumph. It is persistence of structure. Canals still carrying water, laws still guiding behavior, stories still remembered. The individual dissolves, but the pattern endures. Meaning resides in contribution rather than recognition. This perspective tempers ambition. Great works are valued not because they glorify their creators, but because they stabilize the system. Walls protect cities. Temples organize labor. Texts preserve instruction. Even kings are measured by what remains functional after their deaths. The self is secondary to continuity. Modern societies often invert this relationship. Achievement becomes personal. Systems are treated as platforms for expression rather than frameworks for survival. When those systems strain, blame returns to individuals rather than structures. The ancient worldview resists this inversion. It insists that structures shape outcomes more powerfully than intentions. This insistence is evident in how Mesopotamians treated disaster. They did not ask who deserved suffering. They asked what failed, which canal was neglected, which ritual disrupted, which boundary ignored. The response was practical rather than moral. Repair replaced judgment. This orientation toward repair rather than punishment is one of the most quietly radical aspects of Mesopotamian thought. It removes the satisfaction of blame in favor of responsibility. It demands effort instead of condemnation. Such an approach is emotionally unsatisfying but structurally effective. The Anunnaki embody this ethos. They punish, but they also regret. They destroy, but they rebuild. They adjust rules rather than enforce absolutes. Their authority is flexible because rigidity accelerates collapse. This portrayal undermines any ideology that equates power with certainty. In later cultures, this flexibility often eroded. Absolutes replaced negotiation. Certainty replaced adaptation. The result was often spectacular failure. Systems built on inflexible principles broke under conditions they could not anticipate. The ancient texts anticipate this outcome without commentary. They simply show what happens. The final lesson embedded in these myths is not about gods or origins. It is about humility before complexity. No system can be fully understood from within. No authority can predict all consequences. Wisdom lies in responsiveness, not control. This humility extends to knowledge itself. The Mesopotamians understood that learning reveals new risks as well as new possibilities. Every solution opens new vulnerabilities. Writing preserves memory, but enables manipulation. Law creates order, but invites exploitation. Technology extends reach, but amplifies error. These trade-offs are not problems to be solved. They are conditions to be managed. The Anunnaki stories never imagine a state beyond trade-offs. They accept tension as permanent. Civilization exists within it, not above it. As the final tablets were pressed and the last scribes trained, this understanding did not vanish. It dispersed. It embedded itself in habits, institutions, and assumptions. It survived translation, conquest, and neglect because it described something fundamental. Even today, when societies confront systemic crisis, echoes of this ancient logic emerge. Calls for resilience rather than perfection, for repair rather than blame, for limits rather than expansion without end. These ideas feel modern, yet they are ancient. The endurance of Mesopotamian thought does not depend on reverence for the past. It depends on recognition. Recognition that civilization is fragile, that order requires work, that memory must be defended, that authority must remain accountable to outcome. The Anunnaki fade at the edge of this recognition. They are no longer needed once their lesson is internalized. Their purpose was never worship. It was explanation. They provided language for forces humans could not yet describe analytically. When that language became unnecessary, the forces remained. What remains is the choice each generation faces: to treat civilization as entitlement or as obligation, to pursue growth without restraint, or to manage complexity with care, to forget past failures or to integrate them into planning. These choices determine durability more than ideology. Mesopotamian civilization did not survive because it was morally superior or technologically advanced. It survived because it aligned expectation with reality. It assumed collapse was possible and planned accordingly. It did not deny limitation. It worked within it. That alignment is difficult to maintain. It requires resisting comforting narratives. It demands patience, memory, and humility. Yet it is the only posture that consistently supports longevity. The final inheritance of the Anunnaki myths is therefore not a story, but a stance. A way of standing within uncertainty without illusion. A refusal to pretend that order is permanent or chaos meaningless. In adopting this stance, later societies unconsciously step into a tradition older than written history. They repeat the same labor under different names, against the same pressures. Civilization continues not because it escapes these pressures, but because it acknowledges them. The clay tablets may erode, and the names of the gods may vanish, but the logic pressed into them persists wherever humans choose to maintain rather than dominate, to remember rather than erase, to adapt rather than deny. In that persistence lies the true conclusion of the Mesopotamian story. Not an ending, but an ongoing negotiation with reality, carried forward by those willing to accept that civilization is not a gift, but work that never truly ends. What ultimately survives the long erosion of names, cities, and gods is not belief, but orientation. When the last traces of Mesopotamian ritual faded from practice, the world did not lose its structure. It lost only the language that once made that structure visible. The Anunnaki were never essential as beings. They were essential as representations of forces that continue to act whether acknowledged or not. When the symbols vanished, the pressures remained. Civilization still rests on unstable ground. Resources remain finite. Coordination remains difficult. Authority still concentrates power faster than wisdom. Systems still fail when pushed beyond their limits. None of this is new. The oldest written texts already describe these dynamics with disarming clarity. What has changed is not the nature of the problem, but the confidence with which later societies pretend it has been solved. Mesopotamian thought never indulged that confidence. It did not imagine an endpoint where balance would be permanent. Even the gods could not secure such an outcome. Their power delayed collapse. It did not eliminate it. Humanity inherited this condition not as punishment, but as structure. To exist within civilization was to participate in its upkeep, knowing that neglect would bring consequences. This knowledge shaped a culture that valued continuity over triumph. The most meaningful achievements were those that endured quietly, irrigation systems that fed generations, laws that regulated conflict, stories that preserved memory. Heroism was secondary to maintenance. Glory faded. Structure mattered. The modern tendency to celebrate disruption would have seemed dangerous to the Mesopotamian mind. Change was not rejected, but it was approached cautiously. Every alteration introduced new uncertainty. Stability was earned through repetition, not novelty. Innovation required justification beyond excitement. It had to serve balance. This does not mean Mesopotamian civilization was static. It evolved continuously, adapting languages, gods, and institutions. But it evolved sideways rather than upward, adjusting to pressure rather than chasing ideals. Progress was measured in survivability, not speed. The disappearance of this mindset leaves modern societies vulnerable to extremes. When growth becomes unquestioned, collapse accelerates. When authority claims infallibility, trust erodes. When memory is neglected, mistakes repeat. The ancient texts do not prevent these outcomes, but they anticipate them. The Anunnaki myths, read without superstition, offer a form of intellectual grounding. They refuse comfort. They deny permanence. They insist that systems require care. This insistence is not pessimism, it is realism sharpened by experience. Perhaps the most radical aspect of this worldview is its rejection of innocence. No one is exempt from consequence. Not gods, not kings, not communities. Participation in a system implies responsibility for its effects. Ignorance is not absolution. Survival depends on awareness. This principle challenges narratives that divide the world cleanly into heroes and villains. Mesopotamian stories rarely operate on that axis. They focus instead on miscalculation, overreach, and adjustment. Tragedy arises not from evil, but from imbalance. Resolution comes not through victory, but through compromise. In this way, the ancient worldview resists moral spectacle. It does not dramatize suffering for meaning. It records it as data. Loss is acknowledged, not aestheticized. Grief is present, but it does not obscure analysis. Emotion accompanies experience without replacing understanding. This restraint is difficult to maintain, especially in cultures driven by immediacy and amplification. Yet it remains essential for navigating complexity. When every event becomes a moral referendum, structural causes vanish. When attention is consumed by outrage, maintenance suffers. The Mesopotamian legacy offers a corrective. It reminds that the world is not obligated to conform to expectation. That order is provisional. That collapse is possible at any scale. These reminders are not warnings of doom. They are invitations to attentiveness. The Anunnaki, as figures, disappear at this point. Their work is complete. Once humans internalize the forces they represented, the symbols are no longer required. What remains is the task they illustrated: managing imbalance without illusion. Civilization persists because humans continue to perform this task, often unconsciously. They repair infrastructure. They preserve records. They regulate behavior. They respond to crisis. Each action echoes choices made beside ancient rivers under different skies. The distance between then and now is vast in technology, but narrow in structure. The same tensions recur. The same mistakes tempt repetition. The same need for restraint asserts itself. The final message embedded in the Mesopotamian record is neither hope nor despair. It is continuity. Systems break, humans rebuild. Memory fades, humans recover it. Order dissolves, humans reorganize it. There is no final chapter, only successive iterations. This is why the story does not end with resolution. There is no moment when balance is secured permanently. There is only the ongoing labor of keeping disorder at bay long enough for life to continue meaningfully. The clay tablets endure because they captured this truth without embellishment. They did not promise salvation. They offered recognition. They allowed humanity to see itself clearly within forces larger than any individual or institution. That clarity remains available. It does not require belief in ancient gods. It requires honesty about limits, willingness to maintain, and respect for memory. Where these exist, civilization persists longer. Where they are denied, collapse accelerates. The Anunnaki are silent now, but the conditions they named still speak. Rivers still flood, systems still strain, authority still overreaches, memory still erodes, and humans still stand between chaos and order, doing the work required to keep one from overwhelming the other. In that work lies the true inheritance of the ancient world, not myth, but method, not gods, but understanding, not endings, but endurance.